Hello and welcome to episode 48 of the Monday Night Review. Sorry for the unplanned absence last week. I was in the grip of finishing my final exam for my course, which is now done, dusted and it's in, but something had to give. And I actually feel like a grown-up for allowing things to slip a little. Sometimes you've got to give yourself some grace. So we're back this week with something that's fairly recent. It's really unpleasant. It's not a murder. And I usually shy away from things that are too recent because they'll be very raw for some people, and it's obviously lots of people affected by this one. But I watched an episode of Unsolved Mysteries on Netflix a while ago, and I kept thinking of it, kept popping back into my brain. So today we're going to talk about the Ishinomaki Tsunami spirits. At 2:45 p.m. on the 11th of March 2011, the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in Japan's history, and the fourth most powerful recorded on Earth, erupted out at sea. And the tsunami that followed hit the coastal cities, causing death and destruction. A total of 217 square miles were flooded, and worse still, the tsunami caused a cooling system failure at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, leading to the infamous meltdown. The city of Ishinomaki was one of the worst hit, with waters up to 33 feet travelling inland for around 3 miles, covering approximately 46% of the city. Ishinomaki's on the northern top coastal area of Japan. Distressingly, many schools were destroyed, including one elementary school which lost 70 of its 108 students and 9 of its 13 teaching staff. As of the 17th of June 2011, a total of 3,097 deaths had been confirmed in Ishinomaki due to the tsunami, and 2,717 people were unaccounted for. Approximately 29,000 city residents lost their homes, and it's believed in total that the tsunami left over 15,000 people dead. 350,000 people were left homeless, and it became the world's most expensive natural disaster. After the initial hit of the tsunami came the snow. Those who had survived and were clinging to wreckage and no idea how they were going to survive, they were now getting covered in snow. One survivor who lost 54 of his co-workers, it just so happened that he was swept out of his building when the tsunami hit and could therefore get to the surface of the water. He said, "I felt like I was in hell." This is clearly a terrible disaster and horrendous for those who experienced it and lost loved ones. But after the tsunami, something strange started to happen. Arriving in Ishinomaki 2 months after the tsunami, a journalist began hearing strange stories. People reported being woken up by an unfamiliar noise or the sensation that someone was sitting with them. Police began to get reports of strange sightings, ghost people lining up by rubble that had once been a shopping centre, or ghosts standing where housing developments used to be. By October, the journalist had dozens of stories. He stayed until August 2013, visiting those who had experienced what they believed to be something supernatural. One woman who had lost her 3-year-old son in the tsunami said that her son's electric ride-on toy train, which had a manual switch, had turned on one evening when she'd absent-mindedly called him to dinner. She said that before that moment she'd been looking forward to dying, but afterwards was reminded that her son was always watching, and it gave her purpose again. Another woman told how she'd been cooking dinner one night and heard a knock on the door. It was a woman dripping wet who asked her for dry clothes. The lady who'd been cooking went and found some clothes, gave them to her and said goodnight. Later that night she heard knocking on the window, and there were many people standing outside, all dripping wet, silent. Perhaps the most interesting is what was reported among taxi drivers, and the reason it's the most interesting is that They have records for this. So taxi drivers began reporting picking up strange fares. One driver said he had picked up a woman from near the station several months after the disaster. She was wearing a thick coat, despite it being the summer and fairly hot, and she appeared to be drenched and asked to be taken to a district that had been wiped out by the tsunami. When he said, "Are you sure there's nothing there?" She said in a quiet, shaking voice, "Have I died?" When the driver turned round to speak to her, because it was such a shocking thing for her to say, she disappeared. Another driver tells how a man in his 20s gets into his cab and says his destination up in the mountain and points ahead. It's a long journey, and when the cab arrives, it's already dark. The cab driver says, "We've arrived," waits for his fare, nothing. The man's disappeared. So these men were all interviewed by a student called Yuka Kudo for her final thesis. I think she was a sociology degree she was doing. And Kudo had spoken to more than 100 drivers, and 7 of them were willing to be put in print. All of them reported mysterious passengers, and some have it in their logbook. So you can see from their meter readings and from their logbooks that they took these journeys. Now, either it's a massive conspiracy among taxi drivers for whatever reason, because it would be really upsetting if it was made up, to have this sort of conspiracy thing and they were all going to run these false fares. But the fact is, if you run a long fare up to the mountains for no reason, the taxi driver is losing money. So they've got logs that these fares were taken, which means either the drivers are doing it for some weird reason or they actually happened. So it's incredibly interesting. The drivers just wouldn't do it for free. They say the passengers tend to be younger people, and the drivers said they felt no fear or any bad feeling whilst the people were in the car. Kudo's professor believes that the drivers could be seeing things as a result of PTSD. Many of them had lost family and said they would happily take the ghost passengers again if they appeared, if that's what they needed to help them. And though the professor says, if it is some form of collective PTSD, it hasn't been reported after other horrendous incidents. There was nothing like this after Hiroshima, for example. It carries on. It's not just at this few people. Lots of people report seeing their neighbours who had died in the tsunami. These neighbours would come and sit silently as if they were visiting for tea, and they would leave a puddle of water where they'd sat. Really interestingly, Buddhist priest Reverend Tao Kaneta tells of a man who he renames as Takashi Ono, who had become possessed. Kaneta and Ono both live miles from the coastline where the worst disaster had occurred. Kaneta is actually a 26th generation Buddhist priest, and he grew up in the temple where he lives. The temple is up in the hills, and Kaneta helps countless people bury their loved ones. He describes the first body he finds and he sees is of a child, and he just doesn't know how to function or how to move. It's so awful. Ono, however, has stayed away from the disaster zone deliberately, as is understandable, but he finally went and faced it months after the disaster. And he sees this monumental loss and devastation and the destruction along the beaches. And he goes home to have dinner with his family. But afterwards, he goes into the backyard and starts rolling in the mud, speaking in this really guttural and aggressive way. He repeatedly turns to his family saying, "Drop dead. Everyone else is dead, so die." His family's understandably horrified. This keeps happening. And the next day, Ono has no recollection of what he's done. And this went on for a couple of days, and he would even start mentioning names of those who had died, who he had no knowledge of. So his family take him to Reverend Kaneta to be exorcised of the spirit, and Kaneta believes that Ono had been possessed by spirits after driving through one of the worst affected areas, with his window down, and the fact that he was a sort of detached person from the experience. He hadn't lost anyone in the tsunami. He was far away. He hadn't lost his home, and Kaneta believes that the spirits therefore sort of moved into his body to use him as some way of speaking. Kaneta believes that just how the people who survived were in a state of incredible shock, how their lives could change in seconds, the horror of losing someone you love in such a devastating way just left so many people shocked. And he believes that the spirits of those who've died are experiencing the same kind of shock, and so that's why there are all these spirit phenomena happening. One woman is brought into Kaneta saying that she is full of spirits. She had been open to spirits since she was young. She said she'd always been a bit strange, and she'd always been able to see spirits of people. But after about 100 days after the tsunami, she said that the spirits became those who had died, and they were just flooding into her body, and she couldn't stop them, and she could feel so much physical pain that she wanted someone to kill her. But instead her family take her to Kaneta, who spends all night praying with this woman, with his wife. He and his wife do lots of Buddhist rituals, and the lady who he calls Amy, when he grabs Amy's feet, she says she hears the spirit of a man say, "Who are you?" And this must have come through her, because Kaneta says, "I am Tao Kaneta, I am a Buddhist priest." And she says that she could then hear the man screaming and yelling in her, and then he disappears. So this is another woman. She's not been affected by the tsunami. She lived out of the area that was affected, but she gets visited by so many ghosts, and she has to return to Kaneta many times. She says she could feel, smell, and experience some of those spirits. And she says the worst one was this young girl who'd been running with her brother from the tsunami, and he says he can't run anymore. And she lets go of his hand, and the little girl is distraught. She needs to find her mother to apologise for letting go of her brother's hand. And it sounds really distressing. So it's really strange, because Japan is considered one of the least religious countries in the world, which I never thought of it like that, because I always think of it as such a spiritual place. I studied Buddhism at A-level, so I think that's just where I hold Japan in my head is as quite a religious place, but it is one of the least religious places in the world. But for months after the tsunami, all kinds of religious leaders were asked to perform exorcisms and quell unhappy spirits. And although it may not be considered to be a religious act, some religions are very sort of not keen on exorcism or the belief in spirits. Kaneta says there's no God who would be against you helping another being, even if it's performing a ritual that religion doesn't believe in to make a person feel better. Kaneta's very interesting. He says that in Japan, they don't separate the dead from the living in the way that we may do in the West. Shoji is a sliding door made from very thin paper that you may have seen. It's made from very thin paper, and basically Japanese view death to be like that. You can see through it. There's not a big divide. Exorcists were also getting a lot of work. One exorcist we saw interviewed, she was also seeing apparitions, missing heads and limbs. And she says these spirits weren't angry, they're just confused, left in limbo, and she can see them as they died, and they just I guess if you have 1 minute you're at your desk or in your school and the next minute you've died, it's incredibly shocking. She said that the reason there are so many spirits around is they want to go home, but the area's changed so much they don't know where to go. They're looking for their families. She says that she can see them appearing as if through glass, and she has to tell them that they're no longer living. And it sounds quite spooky for her because she sees these groups of people and she knows that they're spirits and other people probably can't see them. So Kaneta is very interesting. He says that scientists go on about ghosts not existing and the scientific reason that ghosts don't exist, and that the ghost existing is a result of people's trauma. But he says if that's what they're experiencing, if that is their interpretation of the trauma, then that's the level on which they need to be met. That is real for them. And telling them that what they're seeing isn't real or anything like that isn't going to help them. They need to be helped in some way. And so that's what he is doing. He says that there's a lot of survivor's guilt. The reality that death is everywhere and life can change in an instant can affect people really deeply and for a long time and in different ways. And he also is so interesting. He says that the range on which people experience life is on a spectrum, and some feel rather than think. And natural disasters can bring out real extremes in this. So those who feel a spiritual existence and who see things will see and feel them more, and some people will need more science to help them explain what's happened, and some people will need more spirituality to get them through. So we know that, but he believes that those people who are able to see spirits or believe they can see spirits are going to be more likely to see them. So this went on for a long time, and the area is still so much affected. I haven't looked into, I can't imagine how COVID has hit that area, because it's been a long road to recovery, both in terms of infrastructure and the society. And that is the story of the tsunami spirits from Ishinomaki. It's just a really strange phenomenon, interesting from a spiritual point of view, interesting from a sociological point of view, just such an incredibly huge disaster for a whole area of Japan that you can understand why these phenomena are happening, whether you believe in ghosts or not. But it's very interesting that the levels of which spirits are reported here, just nothing has been reported like it after any other huge tragedy. Thank you for listening. I hope you are all well. I love to hear from you, so please email themondaynightrevue@gmail.com. Find us on social media at The Monday Night Review, where we are on Instagram, Facebook and TikTok. And send me in your favourite stories that you want me to cover. I will be, as ever, uploading images to go with this story on social media, so it's always a good place to check out. If you've heard a story that you like, but you want to get some visuals, they'll be on Instagram and Facebook. And until next time, be kind, stay safe, and always check the back seat before you drive.